What does the American bicentennial and stagnant water have to do with a prominent hotel? And how do these three things combine to set the stage for one of the most confounding investigations conducted by the Centers for Disease Control? Lastly, what does any of this have to do with Pennsylvania?
Dear listeners, Dr. Pennsylvania.
July 21st through 24th, Pennsylvania's chapter of the American Legion were hosting their 58th state convention, and thousands of members of the American Legions were in the city of Philadelphia. Earlier that month in Philadelphia, President Gerald Ford had been in the city hosting some July 4th bicentennial events and celebrations. Then, just as today, tensions were high and there were terroristic threats being made, and these were being fielded, and security was tight around the clock. Despite these threats, and even despite a strike by Philadelphia's sanitation workers, the bicentennial central month, July, went by without any hitches. That is, until members of the American Legion began dying, and their deaths began to acne the news. The first known death from the American Legion occurred on July 27th, just 3 days after the convention ended. By August 3rd, the Philadelphia Inquirer had reported that 16 members of the American Legion had died since returning home from the convention in Philadelphia just a little more than a week ago. Within 24 hours of the Philadelphia Inquirer reporting that headline, 4 more American Legion members were dead. Through the course of the epidemic, the cause, which would not be identified until January the following year, 34 people would be dead and over 200 have been stricken ill, most hospitalized with flu or pneumonia-like symptoms. Survivors of the outbreak described fevers that would crest over 105 degrees and were often enough accompanied by chest pains and a bloody, mucus, phlegmy cough. Unsure of how the mystery disease was spreading, funeral attendants of these deaths were sparse. Members, even those who were not sick or in fact never even contracted disease and would not contract the disease, were finding themselves ostracized in their community upon returning home. And as the deaths increased, so too did the suspicion and the outcasting of these members, so much so that it would take years for this dark cloud to move away from the American Legion in general. Everywhere you went, somebody had an idea of who or what the culprit was. Indeed, was it not true that threats had been made against the convention, specifically targeting members of the American Legion? Wasn't it likely that the disease was caused in part by the problematic sanitation conditions caused by the worker strike? Even in the earliest days of inquiry and wild speculation, many were starting to point blame at the site of the convention. Regardless of the cause, the disease was already beginning to be known by the stripe of its first known victims, and Legionnaires' disease is born. The Bellevue Stratford Hotel was erected in 1904 by German immigrant and hardscrabble millionaire George Bolt. The budget for the new hotel exceeded $8 million, and we're talking $8 million in 1904, the same year a transcontinental car ride was first attempted. The Bellevue Stratford Hotel was noted upon its opening for its extravagant ballroom and electric lights, and it was very quickly, almost immediately, a focal point of the city of Philadelphia. The building itself sits on South Broad Street, just a couple blocks, 3 or 4 if I remember correctly, from City Hall. The old Philadelphia Spectrum, which has since been torn down, actually was at the other end of South Broad Street, and I'm guessing it would take you about 20 minutes to drive from the Bellevue Stratford to there. Why do I mention the Spectrum? Because the Spectrum was awesome, that's why. And it was also the first place I got to see professional hockey when I was a kid living out in Pottstown. Many presidents stayed at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, including both Roosevelts, Ronald Reagan, and really all in between there. Even John F. Kennedy was there, staying there just mere weeks before his assassination in Texas. Although the hotel had gone through several stages of renovation over the years in order to bring its interior aesthetics and amenities up to date and the expectations of the clients, it was more than prepared to host several thousand members of Pennsylvania's American Legion as they began to arrive in July 1976. The management was having some problems with the air conditioning system though, and specialists were called in. As I stated earlier, this outbreak, this mystery disease, was by the end of the epidemic responsible for the deaths of at least 34 known people, possibly several more, and over 200 others contracted the disease and had to deal with a very aggressive and difficult illness and convalescence. By mid-January 1978, the Centers for Disease Control had identified a bacteria that had caused the outbreak. The bacteria, too, would stand as a reminder of the convention, as the bacteria is known as Legionella. The bacteria was thought to have originated and spread through the hotel's air conditioning cooling towers, which were located on the roof of the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. The cool water was able to stagnate, and as everything got moving, it was circulating through the hotel's ventilation system. That cooling area was where the bacteria is thought to, again, have kind of spread, and it became airborne. And as that cold air was circulating in the July rooms of the hotel, a lot of people were becoming exposed to it. And people passing by the building itself were not immune, as the cool air dropped down from the roof and to the side of the building. Several people who did contract the disease were neither staff of the hotel nor were they patrons of the hotel. Early in the reporting on the outbreak, there was a note that one of the victims, one of the now dead, had been roommates with a couple other men who had not contracted the disease or had contracted and yet survived. And it's important to note, as we would come to understand Legionella, that it's not transmitted from person to person. Obviously, at the time of the outbreak, this was not known. During the outbreak, again, there were a lot of people who were kind of pointing fingers at different ways, and while the Centers for Disease Control are sorting things out and trying to come to a full understanding, a lot of other people are noting a similarity to what was known as, I believe it was Pontiac disease, named after a building in Pontiac, Michigan, where it was the epicenter of a similar outbreak of a mysterious pneumonia, flu-like disease. And in fact, going back, it's been stated that outbreak was Legionnaires, because of course Legionnaires disease has been with us for many years, although it would first be identified due to the outbreak among the American Legion Convention attendees of 1976. Despite the human casualties, the volume of human casualties of the 1976 outbreak, the biggest victim may have been the Bellevue Stratford itself. Because of all the negative publicity surrounding, this was one of the Center for Disease Control's most baffling and really one of their biggest cases. And due to that publicity, the hotel was already closed by November of 1976, a couple months before Legionella would be identified, and the most likely scenario, that of it coming in through the cooling towers where it was breeding in the appropriate temperate water. The hotel would be vacant for a year before changing hands, names, and even purposes over the next 39 years. 1977, a year after the outbreak, it had been added to the National Registry of Historic Places, and a large part of me suspects that this is the only reason why the building remains today. 1978 would see the most significant reinvestment into the building to date, particularly to the large public areas on the first floor, which were restored to their early 19th century appearances as much as possible. So what does the American Bicentennial and stagnant water have to do with a prominent Philadelphia hotel? Well, again, the American Bicentennial has really nothing to do with it other than just being kind of the setting. The stagnant water is the origination point of the Legionella as well as the Philadelphia hotel. Because of the location of its origins and because of the lives of fellow Pennsylvanians, which it took, the origin of Legionnaires and the origin story of Legionnaires in the public mind is very much a Pennsylvania story. And as we move further away from that year, 1976, we're now at the time of this recording 39 years in the future. Fewer and fewer people, first-hand people, are aware of the media presence that the outbreak occurred. And with the fatality rate of Legionnaires drastically reduced since that summer nearly 40 years ago, Legionnaires doesn't really have the impact when we hear about a possible outbreak as we saw recently at the Pittsburgh Veterans Hospital. And maybe it's specifically because of that lack of gravity that maybe we ought to go back and revisit and retell and remember the fear, confusion, and wild speculation that occurred in the wake of this initial outbreak, and do so that we can be vigilant or prepared in some way for the next mystery disease, as it is an inevitable thing.